I wanted to say a very big, warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming to this evening's debate on the Millennium Development Goals. The event this evening has actually been jointly organised between the Warwick Policy Lab in the Department of Economics and the wonderful Economics Society. So I wanted to start off by saying a big thanks to Will and his team who are sat there. It's great to have this collaboration between the kind of student-led society and the department, so that's really nice to see. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm based in the Economics Department where I co-direct the Warwick Policy Lab, and it's my job this evening to set the scene, introduce the panel, keep us all to time, and hopefully keep order when you all have all of your great questions later on. So we have a few questions that we have asked in advance, but we're going to get through those and allow as much time as possible to have questions from the floor and interaction from all of you. So please do be thinking as we go through at the beginning about all of those questions that you want to ask. Without further ado, though, I'm going to introduce our great panel here this evening. So we have here, if I pronounce it wrong, please do let me know. We have Lasya Priya, who is in her second year here studying economics at Warwick. She's also currently the talks coordinator for the Warwick Economics Society, so she may be a familiar face to many of you. And she is an aspiring development economist, so should know quite a lot about the subject that we're talking about this evening. Then I'm really pleased to have Ben Gallaher here, also one of our students, currently studying international development as well. Ben's a rather remarkable being in that he is not only a member of the Green Party, but he is also the Parliamentary Candidate in the general election for Coventry South. And because we're in Purda, I should probably mention on a website somewhere there will be all the other parliamentary candidates for Coventry South. So please do go and have a look at who all of those are. But obviously Ben, you know, is the best one there. Then I have Abhinay Muthoo. Abhinay probably doesn't need much introduction, but Abhinay is the head of the Economics Department. For those of you who aren't in the Economics Department, he also co-directs the Warwick Policy Lab with me. And amongst his kind of specialist areas are public policy and international development. And finally, I'm really pleased to welcome Alethia Cameron. Again, no election pun here, no relation to David Cameron, I have to say at this point. Alethia has come all the way from Rome to join us today. She's a policy analyst at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization with a particular focus on food security. So lots of questions to Alethia on that, if that is your particular area, please. Very quickly, I said we were going to be going through some pre-selected questions. I'm also in a minute going to give our panel members a couple of minutes each to kind of set the scene from their perspective on their take on the Millennium Development Goals, to what extent they think they have actually achieved what they were set out to do, and also looking ahead to the future and what we might have in future. And very quickly, for those of you who have no background in any of this, we had up until now, I think, 8 Millennium Development Goals. They were agreed several years ago. They come to an end this year in 2015. The proposal going forward, which is on the table at the moment, is to move from 8 to 17 Sustainable Development Targets, with 169, I believe it is, sub-targets sitting beneath those. So you might have some view on whether we are just now trying to do everything, or whether actually we need those kind of more specific targets to actually get governments to actually focus in on the things they need to do. We're going to keep some of that rolling behind us to remind you of what the MDGs are and what the proposed SDGs might look like going forward. So I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Lasya to give her a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Siobhan. Just picking up from where Siobhan left off, we have come a long way since the year 2000, when I think around 189 heads of state signed the Millennium Declaration. We agreed, I think possibly for the first time in documented history, that fighting for the betterment of lives around the world was better than fighting ourselves. And here we are today. It's 2015. We've achieved the poverty, some of the goals we've achieved are the one on poverty, access to drinking water, there are fewer slum dwellers in the world, and less gender parity in primary school enrollment. Looking forward, we made that small jump from 8 goals, 18 targets to 17 goals, 169 targets. There was a lot of criticism on that. I think the most scathing one was The Economist, which, and I'm paraphrasing a little, said, oh, it's useless and it's being set up to fail. And I'm going to be taking a slightly different, more optimistic, possibly naive view of that. I think at this point, the fact that we have 169 targets, 17 goals, is in a way a reflection of this generation's enthusiasm and aspirations. The Millennium Development Goals were for a different generation. I was about 5, and as we're I'm sure so many of you in the audience, in 2000. This is a new set of goals for new people. Also, coming down to the technicalities of it, the Sustainable Development Goals essentially tackle 2 different frontiers. They tackle development, they also tackle climate change. They talk about kind of how to address global public goods problems and, overcome national obstacles. More importantly, they also talk about how these goals apply to both people in both rich and poor countries, which has major implications, as it's obvious. And this is why they're more complex to describe, implement, and perhaps, and monitor, definitely. I am just going to quickly conclude by saying, the SDGs, they need a lot of refining. This is just a draft. But at this point, we have a long way to go, and this is definitely a step in the right direction.
Okay, thanks, Lasya. So Lasya says they're new goals for new people. I will leave you to conclude at the end whether she is overly optimistic or naive or not, as she says. Right, Ben, over to you.
Hi, guys. So I'm going to take quite a critical approach of the sort of development discourse. So the Millennium Development Goals, for me, epitomise the last half-century of the development discourse. They've appeared at face value to be quite benevolent. Who could argue with ending poverty? Who could argue with ending hunger? Yet these goals have fallen short, and so has development since insemination. This is insemination after World War II. We can learn from this, however. The fact that the goals haven't reached their capacity and that inequalities have not been overcome under the current development consensus means we need to re-evaluate what development is and what it means. Was it a sincere effort to enrich the lives of the world's impoverished, or was it a Western vanity project which planted a universal label on non-industrialised societies and through the course of time only perpetuated underdevelopment? Whether the aims were sincere or not, and although we cannot argue with the proposed goals, they have come from a top-down approach which is ethnocentric. It has also been restricted by the current global economic system. I personally do not believe goals such as these are necessarily achievable under the current workings of this system. It's a system which has harnessed inequalities and prioritises unsustainable growth. The nature of loans and aid received in order to develop in a way that the West sees fit has led to huge indebtedness. For example, Africa owes $40 million a day in repayments, more than it receives in aid and loans. How is it supposed to sustainably develop when it is restricted in this way? But what does this mean? It means we have to approach the Sustainable Development Goals with caution, but also allows us to consider a different approach, and so we can learn from these mistakes. As a green representative, sustainability is often central to our policies, and it is good to see that it is central to these set of goals. However, we need to be sure what sustainability means. It means not taking from the earth, from society, and from each other more than we can give back. But we cannot make the same mistake as with the development discourse in the last half-century, which could mean that sustainability within those confines means sustaining itself, sustaining privilege, sustaining poverty, sustaining the abuse of the earth, sustaining inequalities, and sustaining starvation in order to prioritise development in a way that the West sees fit. So let's make sure that sustainability is actually geared towards a bottom-up approach and from the local, from local communities, local groups in these regions, and not just a Western-centric, top-down label of this is the rules and you have to sort of implement it this way.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So Ben's view there summed up might be Western vanity project is what we've seen up until now, and going forward, can we do this in a way where we don't take more than we can give back? Okay, over to you, Abhinay.
Thanks. I'll just make a few remarks, more focused on the future than the past. Yes, there's been with respect to the Millennium Development Goals, we all know that we've sort of achieved some of them to some extent. And that is history. Looking forward, and therefore looking and assessing Sustainable Development Goals, I want to make a few remarks at this stage. One is to put them in the context of the world we live in and the world we can forecast to live in over the next 10, 15 years. Because there's no point having a bunch of goals which can only be satisfied in utopia, in an ideal paradise. We can achieve all these goals, have all the resources, because each goal to achieve them requires resources of all kinds. So given that kind of principle I want to apply as I think about these Sustainable Development Goals, of course, in some sense, what are the role of these goals? And I say one of them is, of course, for the world community to communicate and engage with each other on this sort of stuff. One always worries about enforcement. You know, you might agree to do something as a world community. How do you enforce countries to deliver? There's no world government yet to enforce. What are the realities on the ground? One is, of course, we all know the economic crises. You know, it's not just in Western Europe and North America. Even Latin America, Africa, and Asia have faced some of the implications of the financial crisis. And this is, to solve the structural problems in the economic crisis, will take another 10 years. So where are the resources going to come from? We need growth to achieve these. Conflict, second thing. Look around you. And there's so much conflict in certain key parts of the world, exactly where you want to achieve some of these social and economic goals. So I worry about conflict. Inequality is another one, which is achieving these kind of goals in a world where, as Piketty's famous book now has told us, there's growing and widening inequality within nations and across nations. It reminds me of what we need to do. We need to perhaps be more radical and listen to what this Christine Lagarde gave a famous lecture, Dimbleby Lectures, last February, and where her theme wasn't in the role of managing director of IMF. It was an amazing lecture, David Dimbleby lecture, I think it was, about the need for new institutions. And there's no discussion here about new institutions. And you might even say, get rid of the UN altogether. Let's start with new institutions which will address in a pragmatic way the kind of things that these goals are trying to address. Because at the end of the day, one has to choose. As economists know, you have to choose. Is it A or B? You can't have both. Thanks.
Okay, so cautionary there from Abhinay that actually we might not be able to do these without compromising things like growth, equality, might lead to conflict. So bringing in a slightly different perspective there. Alethia, over to you.
I have a more optimistic view. I disagree that they're about an utopia. I think that they're quite achievable targets. This is the most ambitious development agenda that the world has ever seen, considering that, you know, it's quite overwhelming compared especially with the Millennium Development Goals. You know, there was only 8 goals, 21 targets. This is pretty simple to grasp and understand, and that was one of their successes in some ways. But in another way, if we look at it that within the Sustainable Development Goals, you have basically the key aspects of several UN charters and treaties, such as the biodiversity, climate change, human rights. So these are existing initiatives that have been synthesized into a mere 169 targets. So in a way, if you think of it that way, if you think of thousands of pages of technical documents that nobody ever sees, that are only looked at behind closed doors by UN personnel, and that really don't have an impact. I mean, these conventions have not succeeded, and this is worrisome. This is a sobering situation. Basically, we have 2 decades, we're told, right, by the scientific and research communities. We have 2 decades to reverse, to reduce carbon emissions to a point where we will not effect irreversible and catastrophic climate change. And the Earth systems are basically what supports our economy. And so what I want to say is that it is not sufficient to simply extend the Millennium Development Goals. That is necessary to support them with environmental and economic reforms in order to not compromise the successes we've already made in achieving these development objectives.
Okay, so Alethia, making us look at, because one of the big criticisms of the new targets is there are just too many of them, but what you're saying actually, which economists will like, I think, is it's all relative. Actually, if you look at how many other things there are, this is a synthesis of many, many other things. So actually, you could look at it as a kind of distilling of lots of things that we already know we have to do. Okay, keep all of those thoughts in mind. You've got differing opinions there, how optimistic, how pessimistic people are about what we've already achieved and what we can achieve. But I'm going to go first to our first question, and I will take comments from the panel, but then I will throw it open to the audience as well. So Alex, we've got Alex at the back there.
So how much have the Millennium Development Goals really contributed to global poverty reduction over the contribution of the change in global economic circumstances? For example, the growth of India and China?
Okay, so to what extent have the MDGs contributed rather than just events anyway, in particular the growth of India and China in terms of reducing poverty? I'm going to start with Lasya on that question.
It's kind of difficult to say exactly, in my opinion, that it's difficult to say exactly how much it was the contribution of the MDGs and how much it was because these economies progressed. When in any study you look at, you're not exactly looking at a controlled experiment. This is purely observational. Personally, I think that what the MDGs didn't help all that much, but they did create an environment which didn't necessarily, which helped a little, but didn't necessarily hinder much as well.
Okay, Ben?
Yeah, I do think the nature of the goals, they are quite quantitative, and in order to understand how poverty has been reduced, whether by using like the free market, whether by using state investment, whether by sort of using redistribution, a measure of that is probably more needed and more required in order to understand how much these goals contributed to reducing poverty. Obviously, China and India have done quite well to increase growth, but they still have quite high inequalities. The same with Brazil and Hong Kong. They're still in the 15 highest, most unequal countries, and they're considered quite great examples of development or economic growth in the last couple of decades. Africa's extreme poverty has fell from 56% to 48% during the goals, which is terrible. A lot of this is due to the ownership of their natural resources, sort of political corruption as well, which needs to be addressed within the set of goals, within the Millennium Development Goals, I think. And also, there's this definition of extreme poverty. You've got it's limited at $1.25 $1.25 a day, but so we've reduced rates of people in that. But what about $1.50 a day, $1.75 a day? It's not necessarily. I don't think it's a clear measurement of how poverty is reduced. It's more like we have to introduce like the quality of life of people as well.
Okay, I'm going to go to Abhinay and then come to the audience.
So basically, look, you need resources. You need more cake. You need more growth to achieve these kind of goals. Okay. So of course, the growth was important for nation states to achieve these poverty reductions and so on. But what has to be clear throughout? There's no world government. There's no world police. So there's no enforcement. If a state misses any of these targets, no one will go and punish them. You've got to bear that in mind. Hence, that means that these goals have to be, in the language of economics, incentive compatible with the state's objectives. So the state wants to reduce poverty, and of course, if it has the resources, it will do it to the extent that it wants to do it. What the MDGs, you might say, what's the role of MDGs? MDGs, you could think of, they bring the world community together and help focus a bit more a state's, a country's objectives. So that plays an important role. There's coordination issues. You know, again, talking to most of your economists, the MDGs help eliminate externalities. So they have a role to play in doing that much better. And of course, how significant their role is difficult to assess, as Lasya pointed out. And that will be an interesting RAE project to disentangle the effect, the magnitude. So answer is, of course, it has a role to play. And it's through those mechanisms of coordination and reducing externalities and stuff like that. But if it's not incentive compatible with the state's incentive, they won't do it. Why should if India doesn't want to reduce poverty, no one can tell it to do it.
Okay, I'm going to come to the audience at this point. I've got hands on it. We have some mics in the room.
So I'd just like to make an observation that although extreme poverty has halved in China, that's hundreds of millions of people, in Africa, home to 34 of the 48 least developed countries worldwide, only 4 states are on course to achieve the majority of the development goals. That's 4 of them. That's the first point. And I think secondly, we need to consider that, I'd like to address Abhinay's point here about growth. Growth without institutional and structural support merely entrenches the dependency that we are already seeing in private sector. Particularly with regard to Africa, what we're seeing is security development and governance projects continuing to be privatized, even though they're tendered by governments in the West. They're being run for profit. Now, where's that money going? Well, it's certainly not going where it should be, according to the goals. I just wonder if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
Okay, I'm going to go to Alethia, both you can pick up on that, but also on the original question about growth, whether it would have happened anyway without the MDGs.
Okay. Well, I think a common opinion is that you could have predicted this goal being achieved by 2015 if you had been looking at the time at the growth target, at the trends, at the macroeconomic trends at the time. So it may not have had much of an impact at all. In fact, a lot of people have said that the Millennium Development Goals were much more efficient at channeling resources to provide public services such as education and healthcare. And so these are things that really did perform well in sub-Saharan Africa, unlike the poverty reduction. And I think you made a good point about the structure of the economy and the structure of growth and the type of growth that is required to reduce poverty, and that is with job creation. And so this requires first a transformation, increased productivity in Africa anyway, because this is a big problem. The agricultural sector is it's a large majority of the economy, but it's not very efficient. So in China, however, in the 80s, they had a massive increase in output of their agricultural sector, and now they're the most agriculturally productive country in the world. So this is something that has to change, and this is something that is now in a lot of policy frameworks in sub-Saharan Africa, increasing agricultural productivity, also building up the manufacturing sector to produce jobs. Anyway, I'll sort of stop there for now.
Abhinay, did you want to pick up on the point about the type of growth and whether if it's all going back into private sector firms, does that actually help in the long run?
No, I think your point is absolutely valid that, at the macro, you want growth, first of all. But then, of course, you need to look at where you grow. You go back to India, it's the same thing. The same point applies, where there's some people are really benefiting from the growth, especially, for example, the IT sector and certain other sectors. But then 500 million people are still poor. That growth over the last 10 years in India hasn't really affected them. So the same point applies in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, you look at, going back to the debate today, you have to ask those kind of questions which are not in these goals, deep buried underneath them, but they need to be brought out and discussed openly and so on and so forth. And that's, in a way, my point about, in an economic crisis, we need more resources. You need to think about, so India had this kind of employment guarantee scheme, again, trying to use the resources to, so absolutely valid point. I don't have the answers. Economists are studying, some of my colleagues are studying these kind of issues, but we don't have the answers. Hopefully you will have the answers as you try to achieve these goals. As Lasya said, you're the future generation here who are going to solve all these problems. Aren't you?
I'll take one more question, but this then moves us on to our second bet, but I'll take your question first.
Just going back to the point made by Abhinay, just about keep holding states accountable. I just wondered whether any of the panel had any other idea going forward about how to make states more accountable to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Because obviously it's a massive thing. It's great for the UN to come out with these goals, but if none of the states are punished by not meeting them, then surely, coming back to that question, then none of the states will actually do anything to try and achieve it, and instead we'll just look inwards.
That's the $6 billion question. How do you create a world in which you don't have a world government, but through some incentive structure, carrots and sticks, you punish for not reaching goals?
Also, I think it's about encouraging people to look at the economy in a different way. And this is where the statisticians and economists come in who develop the big models that measure progress. And I guess if we can go beyond looking at just the GDP, if we can start looking at natural accounting, natural capital accounting, starting to look at natural infrastructure and take that into account. And so we're giving economic incentive to maintaining resources, and we're starting to appreciate the way that the ecosystem services support the economy and the society together. So it's also about convincing people that this is the way to measure things.
Just out of curiosity, does anybody in the audience have any ideas about how you could hold governments to account? Yeah, we just.
I thought these countries signed up to this. You know, they may not have signed up. And it's also national pride as well. You know, they got to do something to reach the goal, the target. And I only know a little bit about India, but the problem I have is they have this target, but without proper data, it's so difficult to monitor. You see, Indian government is doing so many things at the grassroots level, but there is no data to see where they are going. This is the last proper national representative data was 2005 and 6. That was 10 years ago, and the next one won't be out till 2016. And how do you monitor these things?
Okay, so there is something there about transparency, collecting data, naming and shaming, kind of. Ben, you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, in terms of holding governments account, I think what is really positive about the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals is that we have got an international community that have cooperated together to give a platform for these, for reduction of poverty, for change and climate change, and that at least we've got through that step first. Like it's going to, we've had like centuries of war and conflict, and that, and if we can start to eventually agree on something like this, it's a good start. And you know, it shows that the international community recognise that they have a responsibility now, and I hope if we can continue, considering we're continuing this with the Sustainable Development Goals, with continued cooperation, then there can be an avenue, I think, to hold governments account as long as there is that sort of cooperation within the development goals.
Okay, this does lead us on nicely actually to our second question, so I'm going to turn to Sophie.
Why do these goals not directly address the issue of rising inequality?
Okay, so why don't they directly address the issue of rising inequality, which was something that kind of you picked up in your question as well. I'm going to start with Alethia.
Okay. Well, I guess there's a small why and then a big why. The small why is that at the time of the Millennium Development Goals, they simply weren't aiming to address inequality. It wasn't a big topic at the time. After Branko Milanovic, I believe, released a paper with the big study on the economy of the globe, so looking at inequality by country and then looking at inequality in the world. Of course, the obvious outcome is that the inequality in the world is much bigger than the inequality of the most unequal country. So that has a lot of implications, especially for security, international security, domestic security, people wanting what other people have and not getting it. So this has really big impacts. And I think the world then took inequality seriously, and that's why they're integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals. The big why is, well, why do people not want inequality? I mean, this threatens a lot of the existing power structures and vested interests. According to Oxfam, 1% of the population controls $110 trillion, which is more than the bottom 50% of the population. And this is incredible. So if we address this seriously, this Sustainable Development Goal 10, This implies that CEOs in the financial sector and the energy sector have to give up some of this power, and also political power that comes with financial power, right? So is this possible under the current neoliberal capitalist system when we're trying to strive for as much growth as possible? This is a question. You know, many say that capitalism is totally incompatible with sustainable development due to various embedded logic. However, it's not all at a loss. We could still adapt capitalism in certain ways.
I'm going to go straight from what you just said there to Abhinay on, so picking up on that, is capitalism actually even compatible with sustainability?
Alethia is raising some really big questions here, many RAE projects. No, seriously. I mean, I've got a few minutes, it's 1 minute and 60 seconds. I think this is, let me just add something to what she just said, which is, and to the question that's been raised.
Can I just, does everybody know what an RAE project is?
It's an undergraduate, the straight economic students have to do an undergraduate research project in their 3rd year. So RAE stands for Research in Applied Economics. And I think some joint degree economics and politics and so on, PhD students do it as well. Anyway, it's an undergraduate research project. You can do it in the summer. The university has a scheme as well. So that's what I meant. Or you can do it on the side. You know, you should be doing it on the side on the weekends. I mean, what are you doing with your weekends, for crying out loud? Okay, inequality. Inequality is a big issue. As I said, you know, Thomas Piketty's book, not Thomas Piketty, yeah, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, written similar title to Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital. You must read that if you're really interested in the subject of the next 50 years, which is this subject of inequality. You must read that book for understanding the kind of points you're making about the structure of inequality. Of course, this is focused on, by the way, income and wealth inequality. Inequality can be of other types, of gender inequality and so on and so forth. There are lots of inequalities, but let's focus here on wealth/income inequality. And you can't really have, answering the question, you can't say I want to reduce inequality. You've got to understand the sources that give rise, that you're pointing out. And these are deep issues which, it's apple pie and motherhood and that sort of stuff. So the world community can't really, you could have it as a goal, but, what does it mean? Answer your question and sort of how do we, just moving on from the question, one final remark. This is, you've got to also, I go back to the point about being pragmatic. Maybe as an economist, be hard-nosed. So I hope as students, you will have aspiration and ambition to think big, but at the same time, the vested interest of politics is central to this. As your question was pointing out, the political system, the status quo is what it is. You know what happens right now in climate change for the last 20 years, these negotiations, and this makes my point about how hard it's going to be. The Americans, I don't know how many of you are here Americans, are refusing for 20 years to reduce their consumption levels. The consumption levels of because they need the four-wheel drive to go from that city and whatever it is, the reason. They will not reduce their comfort. And hence, there's no way that India, China, Latin America will say, right, we will stay poor and not burn fossil fuel anymore. So the point I'm trying to make through that example is so hard to get someone who has it to give up something. So inequality, how to deal with it through MDG goals, has to therefore be through how do you get poor people who are the have-nots to have. And that's why it's to do with growth is at the heart of it. Anyone who tells me otherwise, you've got to create more cake.
I'm going to cut, there's a question there and then I'll come to other panel members.
One of the interesting points which Alethia made was that the inequality at global level between the countries is much higher than the inequality at national level. So for inequalities in countries, the governments are responsible for reducing the inequalities, but which organization or who is responsible for reducing the global inequality? And if somebody is responsible, then what are the possible mechanisms or steps by which that can be achieved?
A country tax.
That's a good point, but it comes back to, again, the UN, I guess, sits above it all, but kind of how do you get that all to work together? If you have any response to that, but I'll take another question as well then.
Before I ask the question, I just want to give a bit of context. So there's a few of us around the room, but I was head of design for the Warwick International Development Summit, and so Abhinay was there, and we talked about kind of this question about what the future is for the development goals. One of the things that kept cropping up with all of the speakers and all of the people that we're speaking to was that the way that we have this conversation is wrong, that there's a double standard, there's a divergence between the way that we talk about the way that we give money in the Western world and in developing countries, that if you give money to a startup business here, then it's an investment, whereas if you do that in Nairobi, then it's aid. And you know, it's kind of getting our head around the idea that actually there's local intelligence, there's people on the ground. Because one of the things that Ben was saying in his opening remarks I think really hits a note. And there's that real divergence between you and Abhinay, because Abhinay keeps talking about growth, and that's something that you've talked about at the summit as well. But when we think about growth, we think about it from a capitalist point of view, big companies giving lots of money out to people. But actually, you know, if you look at any TED Talks about what's actually happening in Africa at the moment, a guy called Dr. Alan Pamba started as a doctor on the ground, and then suddenly he now works for GlaxoSmithKline and came to the conference and talks about how local intelligence is really important to sustaining aid and making sure that it's sustainable. So my question to the panel is, and you know, to anyone else that wants to talk about it, is why do we keep putting the kind of the potential and the emphasis on big governments who struggled with their own financial responsibilities after 2008? Shouldn't really be approaching the people on the ground and having a communication with them and saying, what are you already doing and how can we support you in that, working with people literally on the grassroots level?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to keep hold of what you said about startups. We'll come back up to that in a minute. But I want to link what you just said about grassroots and bottom-up with the original question we're still answering around inequality. So I'll come to Ben first and then to Lasya on why not inequality, and actually could we achieve that more through kind of a bottom-up approach maybe?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I completely agree with your point. I think that a lot of the emphasis is on growth, and a lot of the emphasis of the Millennium Development Goals was on the poverty of each nation, not the inequality within the nation, the poverty within it. I do think that we have quite a Western-centric view of what development is, what growth is, what business is, what investment is, and I think we need to go out to we need to research areas in a different way. We need to ask local communities and regions what necessarily they prioritise, and hopefully that could sort of say with agriculture, their priorities in agriculture will be different to our priorities. And I think that necessarily like a focus on sort of I read about alternatives to aid. Instead of giving aid to governments and giving through foreign investment, give it to actual cash transfers to the local people, and they'll spend it in the way that they see fit. And although it might sound to some people a bit blasé and a bit like, well, you're just throwing money anywhere and people can spend it whenever they want. In their conditions, they're going to spend it to survive, and it's going to be on goods and it's going to be on food, and that will help build the economy. And also, I think that we need to have a more qualitative, I mentioned earlier, qualitative sort of assessment of these things. Every region is different, every country is different, every society is different, every community is different. With development, we're kind of sort of labelling a whole load of unindustrialised societies as in need of a certain sort of Western model. But they all have different needs, they all have perspectives, they have different ways of life. I think Walter Rodney, who's a post-colonialist, really good, who did How Europe Underdevelops Africa. He basically went into how certain societies would had religious values of like a forest. They regarded their forest sacred, and even though it's got nothing to do with growth, it's got nothing to do with business, they wouldn't cut that forest down for anything. And that sort of developed their own superstructure, and that their sort of views, sacred views on the forest, determined how their economy was run, determined how their agriculture was run, determined how their political beliefs were, because it was based around their own values on a certain thing. And obviously, it turns out that it's quite efficient to not cut down the forest as well. So that was the added bonus to that.
Okay, so Lasya, last point on the question of inequality.
Well, my points are quite similar to Ben's actually. Just want to pick up a little on the point he made about giving aid to the countries and letting them do what they want with it. A little bit of regulation is required because these are countries where red tape and bureaucracy is a huge problem, possibly by a non-partial non-politically, no vested interest body, but apart from that, similar events.
Okay. Well, this does... Okay, hold on. One question from Ouija. That's all right. I'll let Ouija, because she's one of ours, so I'll let her.
They're all one of ours.
They're all one of ours, but...
No, I just wanted to come back to the original question, because the addressing inequalities are in there implicitly, but at different levels. Gender inequality, that's the development goal, Millennium Development Goal 3. You see, so they are trying to address inequalities, but different kinds of inequalities.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
The thing is, these are all looking at basically horizontal inequalities within populations. But personally, I don't think the Millennium, any of the goals are properly pushing for the eradication of vertical economic inequality across populations, because obviously ensuring basic needs are met and looking at gender discrimination, it's important for human rights, but without pushing for like economic equality, you kind of risk getting back into the same, you know?
I think you guys have to take that one over a drink afterwards. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question because it's very similar to this, and then I'll come to you guys. So the third question from, is it Jamie? Jane? Jamie, there.
Which is better, giving aid to a developing nation or investing in it?
Okay, so as you can see, we've kind of moved on to that anyway. So is it better to give aid to a developing country, or is it better to invest in it? And actually, is there a difference? So I'm going to come to, I think, Alethia, you're probably very well placed to answer this one.
Okay. Sorry. I have a bit of a cold, so. Okay. Well, I would say both. That's the short answer. I think aid is great if it's quality aid. I think investment is fantastic if it's done with the right kind of policies and regulations and responsibility. However, there's been a lot of examples of this not being the case. So I'll just, I mean, aid is almost even a bad word now in the realm of development. And this is one of the reasons why USAID has enforced everyone to say USAID, because they want to take aid out of their name. So, so what's wrong with aid? People are just trying to help. Well, yes, but they also want to help their own country more. I'm talking about official development assistance, right? Government to government. Okay, so these are not full donations. You know, they have to be at least 25% grant, but other than that, they can be loaned with concessional financing. So foreign aid often works more in the favor of the, in the past, it has worked a lot more in the favor of the donor country. And even on the website of USAID, great, but they say proudly that for every dollar they invest, they get $20 in return to their economy. And that's great. So everyone's benefiting. This is fantastic. But in other ways, does it really benefit the other country? Okay, so there's examples of donating wheat, okay, donating food. So this is very helpful for the economy in the States or in Canada, because we are supporting our agricultural producers. However, when we drop this aid in the other country, it completely depresses the prices. And then this is a problem for agricultural production in that country in the long run. Anyway, there's many examples. Also, Canada dedicating farm machinery, which mainly benefit their farm machinery industry. But so anyway, I'll focus on investments now. So investments can also be highly beneficial, but we have to ensure that there's proper regulation. And the United Nations put together principles for responsible investments in agriculture. And this has been working with the private sector and with countries to think about how investments can be more effective. So this, for example, in Africa, we see between 2002 and 2008, actually, there was a six-fold increase or something in foreign direct investment, but there was net negative capital flows. So we have lots of investment coming in, but tons of money coming out. And this is because of, a lot of profit expatriation. And so this is a problem, I think. Anyway, sorry, the short answer is both are good if done well.
Okay, both. I'm going to come. Did your question? Yeah, lady down here on this.
Thanks. Sort of two questions. Firstly, with Paris coming up, what does kind of, since climate change crises tend to hit the poor worst when they have caused it the least, what's the role of carbon tax in targeting those who can actually afford to be taxed? And secondly, what is the place of irresponsible companies that explicitly counteract the SDGs that are supported by the makers of the SDGs, so the countries that have made it? And how can the SDGs kind of change their impact on climate change?
Okay, let me take the second one of those because that relates to this question about investment. So how, as you said, it can be good investment if it's regulated well, but actually you might get terrible investment. You might get companies coming in doing it for all the wrong reasons. So I'll throw that one back to Abhinay, coming back to the kind of investment, aid versus investment question. We'll pick up your other one at the end in general questions, okay?
Jolio, I didn't quite understand. You're saying that how does one control whether it's private sector, typically private sector, poor or bad investment in developing countries? Is that the question?
Basically, companies that explicitly don't aim at the climate change target.
Oh, I see. Okay, right. Listen, I think it's complicated. In some sense, if there's a firm that's going to do something in a country, foreign firm, let's say, right, foreign investment is going to do something in a country which will achieve some objectives, because a country has multiple objectives, many objectives, but in the process of achieving those objectives has an adverse impact on one of the Millennium or now the Sustainable Development Goals. You have to, as an economist, weigh the pros and cons. And the state, which ultimately decides whether to allow the firm to do that investment. So there is control. You can't just go and invest in any country that you like. You need permission, as you all know, right? So the state, a government, ultimately. Politics is more important than economics, by the way. The government, the civil servants will evaluate the pros and cons of that investment in that country and decide whether or not to allow it. So I guess what I'm saying is that, look, if it increases carbon emissions in that country, but it benefits employment more than... I personally think you have to be pragmatic. It goes back to my point about being pragmatic. You cannot, in the end, be idealistic if you really want to have a dent on poverty alleviation, on inequality, on gender inequality in particular, and so on. That's the way it's going to be down there in the reality.
Okay, Lasya, so one, aid versus investment, and also do you agree with Abhinay that actually you might have to not hit one target to achieve another one? Is that the pragmatic approach?
I'm not. So for me, I would just say there is no aid versus investment. As Alethia said, my points would be really similar to hers. They're both important. You won't have foreign investment in areas that aid reaches, which is stuff like healthcare and things like that. So that's
okay. Ben, then, I'm going to ask you Abhinay's point that actually if you create lots more carbon emissions, but actually you create lots of jobs at the same time, is that a compromise worth paying?
Yeah, obviously I disagree with that.
That's good.
Yeah, so basically
Very
I
good.
think two can be done at the same time, and I don't think it's idealistic, so I don't think it's unrealistic. I think I'm a historian, so looking back historically, if any of you developmentalists know of Gershon and said that countries can develop based on the because like countries have developed before other countries, the developed countries can provide sort of better formats for development. So because of the increase in technology, we can use this increase in technology to give nations a different type of development because our development was somewhat unsustainable. I think obviously the idea that it creates unemployment, causes loads of emissions, and it reduces poverty is quite wrong, because obviously Britain did that in the Victorian times, and we industrialised, we created loads of carbon emissions, and inequalities were rife. So I don't necessarily agree with that point, but also we do have the technology, and we do have sort of hope within sort of renewable sectors. We've seen Costa Rica, which has spent a couple of months on 100% renewable energy, and if we can get countries to invest, whether it is through foreign investment, whether it is through aid, in sort of solar technology, renewable technology, in order to develop, then we can, and that will create jobs within itself. That would also create a better sustainability, but also the idea that, I don't know, that we can only reduce poverty by continuing to industrialise in this way and create jobs and sort of contribute to carbon emissions is quite backwards within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals. So yeah, I disagree.
Okay, Abhinay, you're backwards.
I just want to make a point in that, you know, as you here, as the international community, think about international development, think about development in different countries. Different countries. You know, what's being recognized by research, by evidence, is that you can't anymore just transplant, which was the approach till recently, till 10, 15 years ago by the international community, transplant institutions, transplant technology from, let's say, the United States or Europe to India or wherever. You can't just transplant it literally, pick it up in the aeroplane and the ship and put it down and say, right, now develop in 5 years. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that for a whole host of reasons. Culture matters, context matters, environment matters, and so on and so forth matters. I think, take for example something which is fundamental, which we're not discussing. Many parts of the world, they're not developing because the rule of law is not strong enough. You can't transplant the rule of law from England to India. It doesn't work like that. It needs to grow, and so on. It might not take, in England, the rule of law took 1,000 years to come about. Yes, maybe in India it might take only 200 years, but it ain't going to happen in 10 years by picking it up from England and saying this is the rule of law and put it there. Rule of law is a very complex notion. And in a similar way, everything else. However, that said, the international community can support, can enable. So, of course, a lot of knowledge and technology has been developed in the United States and Europe. And I'm not saying, therefore, it's useless. Of course not. But you have to go with an open mind and take that knowledge, the technology, to, let's say, against Africa, wherever it is, and ask the question with an open mind. How do I adapt it, if at all, for the local conditions and so on? And then work hard in that way. And I just want to mention that. We need to think about development in that way.
Okay, we have a comment here from the floor again.
I really don't want to target you, Abhinay, but like basically what I really disagree with what you've just said.
That's good. Go on. So target me.
Like the context of infrastructure is valid. I completely understand what you're saying. That you can't just drop machinery into a country and be like use it. But the best resource we have is talent. And the thing is that within the EU, within this concept, we're very fortunate that people can travel from one way to the other. There's a lot of particular parties, one person in particular, that wants to stop that from happening, which I think is a really bad idea. Infrastructure starts from people. The best way to implement a system within a developing country is to send someone over. And so the reason that there's this divergence between aid and investment is because that, especially for big companies like we were talking about before, there's an added risk of developing in a developing country because there's more chance that it could fail, basically. Whereas if you're sending over your own talent and you're telling people that actually we're investing in you in terms of people as well as monetary value, there's definitely the idea that those people can develop something by themselves. And so when we look at it from that point of view, I don't think it's valid to turn up and say, oh, we can't just put in the infrastructure, we can't just do this, we can't do that. Like there's definitely, like Lasya says, a more optimistic approach to doing things, and it starts with putting people on the ground and learning things from a local intelligence, from a cultural perspective. It's not as if we can't do it, it's just more difficult, which is why we
I don't understand at all what you're saying, by the way. I'm trying to get a thread of what you're saying. If you're saying that sending someone over, what does that mean? I mean, can I send people who have been party to the development of rule of law, whatever technology in England? Are you saying, of course I'm not saying, send that person over to India, South Africa. Of course send them and they have to work locally with local conditions, but they shouldn't expect, that's my point, to say, here's the technology, put it down here, and off I go, it can work now. My point is that that has been the expectation for the last 40 years, last century, on how development can happen. It's failed. If it's true, by the way, if it's true that all the technology that we have produced in the West can fix the development problems in India, South Africa, do it. It doesn't work like that. It won't work. That doesn't mean it's a 0-1 thing, that therefore we just do nothing. Of course, we have to go there and take what we have learned over the last hundreds of years, but we have to recognize it's not a transplant option thing. Last 70 years of development, if you look at the big macro picture level, yes, you can point to great things that have happened, but look what's still happening 70 years since the post-war agenda, so the UN system was set up in 1945. How many years? Nearly 70 years. At the macro level, failures left, right, and center.
Okay, I've got 3 questions. You're getting the audience going here. So I've got a gentleman there at the back, yeah, on that row, the grey T-shirt. Yeah. Is what did I didn't? I still didn't hear.
Natural resources, or resource.
Okay.
Natural resource based.
Who wants to answer? You want to answer that one?
I'll give it a go. I think that's part of it. Natural resources extraction has been, particularly oil mining industry like that, has been the biggest driver of sub-Saharan Africa's growth, and this is why a lot of it hasn't provided for job creation.
It's called, by the way, there's a whole literature on this. It's called the resource curse. Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, is all about that. The answer is absolutely. So you can't transfer. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
We had another, the lady there at the back.
Going to ask a really controversial question here, and it's picking up on Abhinay's point of implanting technology and how Alethia has said before, we can't, like, we could be like, oh, let's have like windmill fields and just build them in Sweden and send them over, and that would sustain the European economy, clearly not the African one in this case. And the true question I want to ask to you is, who are we to say this is the right development? Who are we to say our technology is what's going to make you better? Like, who are we to say, oh, you should be sustainable because when we develop, we polluted as hell and no one told us anything. You know, what is our right to go over and say you should do this and this and this to be like us? Why is us good, by the way?
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if we're transplanting, as Abhinay said, certain industries, certain machines into these regions, the poorer nations, the global south, whatever, then it's encouraging them to develop in a way that we see fit. It's still very top down. It's not asking them what they want to do. It's not asking them. It's the same with infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure is nice, but we don't want these places do not need to look exactly like Britain. They don't need to look exactly like America. They don't have to have buildings and skyscrapers like we do just to declare that they're developed. It's an understanding of their cultures and their values, and I think that, yeah, you are right, and I think the only thing that we can dictate is just to tell these countries, don't make the same mistake that we did in terms of industrialisation and heavily degrading the environment.
Lasya, because we've got loads of questions coming. Lasya.
Sorry, just want to add to that. The whole controversy of this double standard thing that's going on. I think one way to address that would be to give a greater voice to developing nations. So, yeah, that's it. We can go to the next question.
Okay, I've got a gentleman there in the check shirt. Yeah.
So, I'd like to point out, first of all...
Oh, sorry. I'll come to you in a minute. The one in front. That's my Dimbleby moment, then we'll come on.
Hello there. Do you feel that the Millennium Goals have suffered from being phrased in socialist terms rather than more economic terms? I'm from the Center of Education Studies, and in education, a lot of the phraseology of the department in this country has gone from Department of Education to Department of Education and Skills, and so on and so forth. And one of the great fears of the government is that if standards don't keep rising in education, we'll fall back economically, our competitiveness will reduce. And then secondly, you'd asked us to think about, is there a way of making governments accountable or countries accountable? Of course, in education, league tables have done that, to whether right or wrong, pluses and minuses to that. And unintentional league tables like OECD's PISA, it's now the big craze within education that governments are terrified of being rated lower than others and to change entire systems and prepare students specifically to pass these tests that will rate them. Could there be an equivalent with regards to this subject? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to answer the socialist phrasing rather than, yeah.
Yeah, I don't really think it's socialist in terms of its phrasing. I think that it's very much kind of like typical Western philanthropic sort of phrasing that the haves would like to do better for the have-nots, but necessarily the fact that it hasn't worked means that the haves and the have-nots still remain pretty much in the same place. I don't think the fact that the Millennium Development Goals are working within the confines of a neoliberal economic system, and in some ways it hasn't worked. I don't think the goals would be achieved under this system. I don't think that it has that socialist inherence because of they're well aware of what the goals are under. They're well aware of the system within which it's been introduced. Also, like the values of growth and like trying to reduce poverty. Again, it's still quite westernised, and it's like the American dream almost is being transplanted to these regions that you can grow and you can become rich as well. And I think that's a very neoliberal thing, the American dream. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily socialist.
Did you want to say anything about the language?
I could, by the time you're running out of time, so.
Okay, we've got one more question, but I am going to take. Okay, I'm going to take these three and then go on to our last question. So, gentleman at the back.
Sorry. Thank you.
You know what? I'm going to take all three together and then put them to the panel.
Okay, so regarding green development, Costa Rica was brought up, but Costa Rica is not exactly the rule of thumb for the world because it has 75% due to hydroelectric power generation, and this only happens because of Costa Rica's unique geography and everything. How can actually, and this question goes more like to Ben, how can you actually believe that most of the other developing nations can realistically develop through completely green ways, given that other methods, such as fossil fuels, are much cheaper at the moment and also more efficient? Isn't R&D, investing heavily on R&D by the Western countries, the only way to actually improve green technologies and then try to make this transfer, rather than building inefficient renewables that are currently not as efficient as they should be?
Okay, great. Hold that thought. So, green technology being very expensive, not every country is like Costa Rica, down here.
Building on Abhinay's point that development is a very long-term thing, and also Lasya's point that the new 169 targets are for a new set of people, how useful would it be to have a long-run, say 50-year target with 5-year intervals to stay consistent in terms of meeting those goals?
Okay, thanks. So taking a long-term approach, and then the last one of these three.
So there's two enormous elephants in the room here. The first of all, environmental sustainability. Why is it why is this goal 7 in the original MDGs, and why is it goals 14 to 16 in the SDGs? I mean, if we don't ensure a zero carbon economy or some form of realistic environmental sustainability, we're just going backwards. We might as well not have even established the MDGs in the first place. You know, by definition, it's absurd, it's regressive. We're going to lose all the ground we've gained if this isn't solved. The second elephant in the room is intellectual property. Now, this is this is very relevant, because if we want to share technology across, you know, whether it works or whether it doesn't, whether you can or you can't drop technology into a place without it and it works, the barriers that exist in international trade and intellectual property are really prohibitive. And I'm talking not just in terms of renewable energies research. We're talking about generic medicines, internet security, even the free movement of people, as you were mentioning earlier. In fact, at this university, the Warwick Library is host to British Petroleum's archive. Now, they refuse to open any of their renewables research from 1976 onwards. And there's a huge amount of stuff in there. But they're legally entitled to do so. So I think until we get our heads around the complex legislation in intellectual property, then we're not going to be able to make the most of the innovations that are taking place in the high end of the economy.
Okay, I'm going to go to Alethia. Any of those three questions to take your fancy.
Okay, I think I can't speak about intellectual property rights on technology, but I mean in terms of physical technology, but in terms of seeds, it's a very big issue right now for food security and for food sovereignty. We have cases where aid is coming in to help. Or investments in Ethiopian teff seed, because this is the new. Has everyone heard of teff? Anyone? Okay, never mind. It's an indigenous grain to Ethiopia, and it's gluten free. So it's the new health rage in North America, and so a Dutch company came and sort of helped develop these teff strands, but how did this work? Ethiopia did not have the proper legal system in place to protect their genetic resources, and so this is the really important thing, is that countries need capacity building support to put these legal systems in place to protect their own genetic resources. Otherwise, it's very easy for international companies to come in and utilize their genetic resources, patent new seed varieties, and then take them back, and also then gain a lot of profit from that. So this is really important.
It goes back to previously about bad investment as well, and exploitation as well. Lasya, any of those three questions?
Yes, I'd like to address this question. 50 years, it's possibly, I don't think it's a good idea, because for this 15 years, the momentum only really started picking up around, say, 2008, 2009. So imagine, if you had a 50-year deadline, no one would end up doing anything for the first, possibly 40 years. It's like how you prepare for an exam. You just don't end up doing anything exactly. So 50 years works best. 15. Also, if I can just address the question as well. The sustainability was included in the original set of goals because the whole sustainable movement picked up a lot of importance and publicity only in the 21st century. Also, in terms of branding, personally, I don't think there's any particular loss of branding because you're carrying forward more or less the same goals from the Millennium Development Goals. But you're also adding sustainability to it, which is necessary and important because, as they all agreed in the Rio Summit, that without sustainability, most of these goals are kind of null and void because you would need sustainability to go into the future.
Okay, Ben, I'm going to give you 30 seconds on Costa Rica.
Yeah, obviously, so yeah, it's quite a rare case, and however, it shows that it can be done. It shows Costa Rica are an example that not many countries have actually tried to use renewables in such a way as Costa Rica. So therefore, it sets a good example. Also, like, we have the technology and we do have the research. Why can't we give, instead of talking about the price of renewables, why can't we, instead of extracting resources and oil and diamond reserves and minerals and using them to create certain machinery, why can't we just use the technology that we have and the expertise we have and give that through aid instead of just saying that follow the industrial model?
Okay, we are very close to having our reception outside, and I know lots of us are probably looking forward to a drink outside. I'm going to take the last question very quickly, and I'm going to take a couple of questions from the floor, and then ask the panel to answer any of those that they like, and then we will all continue talking in the reception outside. So the last question from Francesca.
Hi, how can the UN successfully focus regional governments on the SDGs instead of prioritising their own local issues?
Okay, so the last official question was how can we get governments to focus on the SDGs and not just their own interests, national interests. Anybody else throughout the discussion today had anything that they want to ask to the panel, put to the panel? Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to build on what Alex said and about how patent and copyright have been prohibited, and it's framed in a way that it's an issue, but in our discussion I think it should be framed as an opportunity, because when you've been talking about aid, it's the undertone has been about capital aid, hard capital aid, but for example in the World Bank, the most successful infrastructure projects has been not where they poured in a lot of money, but it's when the World Bank acted as a knowledge bank. So I'm just saying it shouldn't be framed as such an issue. It should be framed as where we start, and I was wondering if you agree.
Okay, great, thank you. And there was a question there. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering if we're going about this in the wrong way, if we're thinking about it in the wrong way, in that we're addressing a centralised issue. We're saying, what should governments do to help development? When Alethia pointed out, the top 1% have this massive inequality, this massive amount of wealth and income. That's, I think, an Oxfam statistic. As a reference point, to be in that top 1%, your income has to be above $34,000, so that's about £23,000, and that's below the average starting salary for an economics graduate. So this isn't really, I mean, yes, there is centralised inequality, but the massive inequality is a private one, so is what we need more than goals for our governments, a society that encourages giving, because we are the 1%.
Okay, that's a great question to end on, I think. So is it not government, is it more that we should encourage private giving? Okay, I'm going to start with Lasya. I'm going this way. That's one.
I just want to pick up on your point. You are a society that encourages giving. Yes, it's a great idea, but precedent, or I mean, whatever's happened till now, it shows that the top 1% gives only if it gets back. So it's a great idea, but for me, I don't see how it can happen. So that's why you pick on centralized government, because that's one way of getting things done.
Anything on regional, local, how do you get governments to not just look after their own backyard?
Yeah, sorry. In terms of regional government and SDG focus, this is specifically, I think, in terms of the least developed nations, that they would have a conflict where, when you're in a situation where you could focus your resources on something that will give you more economic benefit than anything the SDGs could give. There have been instances of this. But for that, I think it's quite counterintuitive, personally, to me, because SDGs, somehow, it kind of all helps you to long-term economic development anyway. So I guess one way would be to add something to the SDGs, restructure it a little bit to make sure that it kind of is inclusive of what regional government priorities as well.
Yeah, so just your point, I think it's not just the notion of giving, it's about giving back. I think youth development, a lot of, again I'm taking the historical route, but the legacy of colonialism is completely imperative to the issues we talk about today. The fact that we have a history, especially in Europe, or especially in a history of extracting resources, exploiting peoples, and accumulating capital on the back of people's slavery and people's working under certain is a massive thing, and it's not just about giving, it's about giving back. And I do think that the development goals and sustainable development goals do give a platform and an avenue through which we can do that, but also this sort of knowledge needs to be known, and this needs to be filtered through, I think, the education of development, because it's something that now is just like, these countries are poor, there's some money, but there's no reason, there's no explanation as to why that is, and I think we have to look within ourselves in order to look outside and externally.
I think, unless I'm mistaken, the last question was not about giving. I mean, I explained, the last question was a fantastic question. It's a reflective question, looking at all this from a distance, and which is about, it's a world community. One, this is my interpretation, I'll tell you And it's not just, when we think about any community, be it a rural community, be it a local community, we have to ask the question, how do we bring prosperity about? And I'm going to use the word prosperity in a broad sense, happiness, material wealth, and anything else you want to put in there. Every actor has a role to play. And the state, of course, has a role to play. The state in the UK spends 50% of our wealth. And so the state has a role to play. But what's been missing, and this is your point, is what about the role of the individual? What about the role of other groups, other organizations, private or public sector? That's absent from the SDGs implicitly, stroke explicitly. And if you really want to think about international development seriously, now the SDGs, I'm not saying they're not serious, but they're not really serious. As I said earlier on, I think they should be scrapped, the UN should be scrapped, not your job. They should keep a job in the new reformed institutions that are fit for the future, the next 20 years. And those institutions should recognize the role of the internet, social media, and so on and so forth. That will address your question. For example, just look at, it's not about giving. Giving is a trivial issue. We should do that. That's not the heart of the matter. Heart's about behavior. Immigration. What's happening in the UK right now? Anti-immigration. We don't want immigration. So how does the world community, and it's also in the UK, it's all over the world, how does the world community change people's minds, their hearts, that actually the free flow of people is good for prosperity? That's what the world community should be thinking of, deep issues like that. We need to think about the future. The future is different. The 50-year thing, who knows what's going to happen in 50 years? We might have little things on our heads and we communicate that way. So I think, a brilliant question then, cutting to the heart of all this nonsense. It is, at the end of the day, by the way, the SDGs, it's all apple pie and mother. Yeah, as I said to you, it is a nice thing, and the world community leaders get together, have chit-chat over dinners, and in September we'll have another dinner, and they'll say, fine, let's do this and that. Is it really seriously important? Not at all. It is useful as a focus, as a coordination. I'm going to debates like this, but is it really going to be the driver of reduction of poverty, of international development? No. It's the answer to your question. How do we change the minds of people across the world that free flow of labor, capital, all the good stuff is good. Behavioral science, behavioral economics is helpful in that regard. And I'll stop here.
Did you want to say anything about the intellectual property knowledge?
Very important. Again, same point arises. You know, it's about, that's why politics is crucial. Vested interests. Your petroleum, it's vested interests. So if you want to really understand and study development, tear this up, talk about, get rid of this, sorry. Ask the hard question. How do you get into, I was talking about technology transfer. Forget about that. Even they don't want to transfer knowledge. We're going to pay a price for it. Ask those questions as economists, as scholars, as thinkers. How do we incentivize individuals and firms? And you have to incentivize to the market mechanism. You can't afford. There's no world government that can go put a gun to BP and say, do it. Well, you could, but that's not how it operates. How do you incentivize BP to release that? Through carrots and sticks. Someone gave a great example to the market mechanism, you education person over there. That's what you've got to think about if you really want to find solutions. And by the way, I go back to behavioral science and behavioral economics because some of the solutions for these issues could be found thinking differently in that way. And why behavioral science? Because they're cheap. You know, the nudge agenda. So applying nudge to international development is very new. The World Development Report this year come out. I don't know how many of you look at this. The World Development Report 2015 is a must for all of you. It is answering it's the answer to your question. You should look at it. It's easily, I can send a link to it. It's free, PDF, online. And it talks about how to, the next 10 years is not the role of the state, is the role of the individual through changing behaviors.
Okay, seeing as Alethia's come the furthest to be here, and Abhinay just recommended shutting down your organisation, I'm going to give you the last say on any of those boundaries.
Okay, can I address all of them a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, I didn't want to take a completely negative approach to intellectual property rights because there is a lot of opportunity to utilize those. And in research and development, definitely has been shown to have a huge outcome in terms of helping developed countries and agriculture. Private giving, private wealth. I think democracy is really not been discussed enough. I mean, we're supposed to be living in a democratic society. This is what people want. People want equal wealth. People want equal rights. This is what the people are saying. This is what the grassroots are saying. The grassroots, sorry. I mean, this is what has come out in the Sustainable Development Goals. Because the Sustainable Development Goals were put together through a different process than the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were sort of written up by Kofi Annan and handed to the governments signed them, and then realized a few months later, oh yeah, I guess we got to do some development here, guys. But the Sustainable Development Goals have been drawn up in a multi-stakeholder, intergovernmental process with 97 national negotiations over the last years. FAO has been incredibly involved in this process, talking to civil society organizations, farmers organizations, asking people what they want. There's also been this online survey, what does the world want? So here we're starting to move into a more democratic way of deciding our global vision. And I think this is a really important thing. The Millennium this process, this intergovernmental process is expected to continue throughout the next 30 years, the next 15 years, in monitoring and evaluating and measuring the progress of these goals. Governments are participating to develop indicators, regionally specific indicators that all of this is supposed to provide ownership, right? It's supposed to create ownership, and this is a hopeful point. This, we think, if people are taking part in the discussion, people are more likely to want to realize the goals and objectives that they themselves set. So,
brilliant.
I think it's hopeful.
Great to leave us on a hopeful note. Something that you can all continue discussing over a drink outside in a moment. Before I say a final thank you to the panel, I do want to plug one other event, because as important as these issues are, we also have another important event coming up on the 7th of May, which is the general election. For those of you who are interested in the issue of whether or not it's even worth young people voting nowadays, because you might not like any of the choices, and I'm sure it would have been quite interesting to have had a UKIP person here, for example, in this debate tonight. We're having a debate about that very issue of young people and voting next Thursday. So if you're interested in that, please look on the economics website, on the Warwick